licensing now, in many countries, including this country, more people are covered by licensing than by trade unions or collective bargaining. And the figures that I've got, even in the 1980s, 800 occupations in this country were subject to licensing. Now it's well over 1,000. Something like, in the 1960s, 5% of the US labor force was covered by licensing. Now it's well over 20%. Unionization, as we all know, is down to 7%, so you can work out, even though we know in the public sector it's more, but you can see that licensing is winning hands down. And I have some rather interesting things, if I may just throw in a thing. The one I particularly like as a good example is horse tooth floating. Now, I bet none of you, just as I didn't, know anything about horse tooth floating. This is a revered occupation in Texas. So you should know more than I know. But anyhow, horse tooth floating is, the thing is that horses, when they're in the fields, they tend to eat the grass and it makes their teeth sharp, and the teeth then go into their gums and can do them severe damage. So the idea of horse tooth floating is you put your hand down the mouth of the thing to make them sort of less sharp, the teeth less sharp. Now, as you can imagine, there aren't a lot of experts in horse tooth floating. And the trouble is that they've now got a licensing system saying that you are not allowed to practice horse tooth floating unless you've got a full veterinary degree. Now, of course, it turns out that a lot of the experts in horse tooth floating don't have a veterinary degree, and they probably deserve to be having some other degree of altogether different. But they're being banned from doing horse tooth floating, which is, of course, typical of a licensing system. Another one is funeral directors in a number of US states. A funeral director, in order to be allowed to practice, must be a qualified embalmer. Now, most people burying people just put them in caskets. They don't have to do any embalming at all. But unless they've got their qualification in embalming, they're being blocked by licensing. So you get a whole lot of crazy examples of licensing that's being practiced. But nevertheless, licensing is spreading and has spread all over the world. And it has all sorts of connotations and problems that it brings with it, which I leave you to imagine. There is also negative licensing, which has also grown. Negative licensing is where the state is assuming control over telling people when they can stop, when they have to stop practicing. So, and they can either be suspended, or they can be penalized, or they can be thrown out of practice. And it's very interesting that among the trends that this has unleashed is a very dubious development. That is, you don't subject the delicensing, if it were, to the standard practices of law. You actually use a much lower level of due process. So if they think, this board, whatever it is in various countries, that you might do damage by practicing badly, then they can suspend you or excommunicate you from practicing. And this is done quite a lot. And of course it opens up all sorts of very corrupt sort of practices. But notice that there is no due process. You don't have to go through a court or anything like that. And they've done that in the medical profession, again, in Britain and in France and so on, where, again, you can be suspended from being a doctor or a nurse just on suspicion that you might not be good. Again, this is state control. The third form is accreditation. And accreditation is the one I particularly favour, and Adam Smith certainly would have favoured it, but where you allow people to practice who are not licensed, but people have to have a certificate so that it's up to you as a person, you make your choice. Now that actually isn't winning relative to licensing. Now moving quickly to the next theme, because I'm going to run out of time, apologies. The next theme of the book is, in a sense, the Hamlet of the book, as far as I'm concerned, which is the growth of inequality and the changing character of inequality. And I think it's quite significant that in the globalization period, with the emphasis on competitiveness, which is the neoliberal model, it's quite a distinct model, you actually get deliberate fostering of inequality. All these governments who pretend, oh, inequality has increased, how terrible. Well, the model itself has an orientation to inequality. And of course, you've seen a growth of economic insecurity, which I won't go through because I want to highlight just a few key points about the inequality story. The first point is that the functional income inequality has grown much greater. In other words, the share going to capital is growing, the share going to labor has been declining, and there's no surprise in the reason. There are a lot of reasons, but the major reason is the emergence of Chindia. Now, Chindia and the other emerging market economies, Chindia being China and India, has essentially quadrupled the world's labor supply. Quadrupled the world's labor supply. So you've added 2 billion workers who are resigned to working for a tiny fraction of what you could earn here or in Germany and so on. Some calculate 1/50th, something like that. Now, it's no surprise that you've had stagnant real wages in the United States, in Europe, declining real wages in net terms in places like France over the last 30 years, and real wages will continue to stagnate and fall. I believe that it's a fool's paradise if you think that we're going to reduce inequality by pushing up real wages. I really do, because that will merely lead to more outsourcing and a more shift to the developing countries, to the emerging markets. Now, the big thing that I want to emphasize, and what I'm working on intensely now, is that you've had a class fragmentation. Class has not gone away. You've got a class fragmentation that's developed where you've got the elite and the salariat and what I call proficients, those people, like most of us in this room, who have a bundle of skills that can move around, and you know, we have fancy incomes, but we're not necessarily tied to our particular job. The old core working class is declining globally and so on, but beneath that is a precariat. And the growth of the precariat is the big new phenomenon that's being taken place around the world. Now, this precariat is not just people who are in temporary part-time jobs, although they are. Many are in subcontracting and so on. They're losing access to benefits, enterprise and state benefits. But key point is that they're not the nucleus of a new proletariat, not the nucleus of a working class. They have no secure social income. Sometimes it's a good idea to think of them as modern nomads, drifting around without a sense of place. Denizens is a word I rather like. More and more people are denizens. They lack a sense of social identity. They lack what Hannah Arendt would have called a social memory, a sense of belonging to an occupational community, and at the same time they have no shadow of the future in their dealings with other people. They don't expect to be dealing with the same people in the future, so there's no shadow there. And I think the globalization crisis is merely accentuating the growth of the precariat. It's accelerating the growth. More and more firms are shifting people into precariat type jobs, and more precariat jobs are growing around the world. But I think it's very important not to think of the precariat solely as victims, solely as a lumpen category. That's wrong, because in a sense, and I talk to a lot of precariat type people while working on this book, some are driven into it. Some are forced to do it, but some are not, particularly older people, older workers. And of course there are varieties of precariat emerging. I won't go into that either. But you see that the precariat, as it's emerging, with the women, the youth, the elderly, ethnic minorities, and most of all migrants in it, is at war with itself. The different components are often in intense relationship with others. And I think the migrants is the key category of a global labour market.